Before we begin, understand this clearly. What you are about to learn in this video will show you how situations are shaped, how perceptions are controlled, and how influence is applied so quietly that most people never realize it is happening. But power without awareness is dangerous. That is why this is only one part of what you must understand. Because in the next 72 hours after this video is released, another video will follow. A critical one. A necessary one. Titled, How to Avoid Being Manipulated and Catch Manipulators Before It's Too Late. Because it is not enough to understand how situations are shaped. You must also understand how to recognize when someone is trying to shape one around you. So as you watch this video, remember this. You are not just learning how influence works. You are preparing to recognize it. And in 72 hours, you will learn how to protect yourself from it. Most people believe situations happen to them. They walk into rooms thinking outcomes are decided by logic, fairness, or chance. They believe the strongest argument wins, the loudest voice dominates, the smartest person takes control. But that is not how the world actually works. Long before you speak, long before you react, long before you even realize what is happening, the situation has already been shaped, and if you do not understand this truth, you will spend your life reacting to outcomes that were decided without your awareness. Because every situation, whether in business, relationships, leadership, or conflict, is not just a moment. It is a battlefield. Not of fists, not of weapons, but of perception. And the person who controls perception controls reality, not openly, not loudly, but silently, almost invisibly. That is the nature of true manipulation, not the kind people fear in movies, obvious villains pulling strings in the dark. No, real manipulation does not look like manipulation. It looks like coincidence. It looks like natural outcomes. It feels like your own decision. And that is why it works. Because the most dangerous manipulation is not the one you resist. It is the one you never notice. Think back to moments in your life where you entered a situation believing you had control, only to realize later that things moved in directions you did not intend. A meeting where your idea lost support before you even explained it. A conversation where someone subtly redirected the focus until you found yourself defending something you never meant to defend. A conflict where, somehow, the narrative turned against you, even though you knew the facts were on your side. You walked in confident, but you walked out cornered, not because you lacked intelligence, not because you lacked strength, but because someone else understood something you did not. They understood that situations are not won inside the moment. They are won before the moment even begins. And once you see this, everything changes, because you begin to realize something uncomfortable. Most people are not losing situations because they are weak. They are losing because they are blind. Blind to the silent forces shaping outcomes. Blind to the invisible structure behind decisions. Blind to the reality that every situation has a hidden architecture, built by someone who understands how perception works. Well, and if you are not the one building that architecture, you are the one living inside it. Here is the first truth you must accept. Every situation is framed before it is fought. Before the first word is spoken, before the first move is made, someone has already shaped how others see the situation. They have planted expectations. They have guided interpretations. They have positioned themselves, not just physically, but psychologically. And by the time the situation begins, the outcome is already leaning in their favor. Not because they forced it, but because they prepared it. This is what separates those who react from those who control. Most people enter situations emotionally. They react to what they see. They respond to what they hear. They fight the visible. But the strategic individual, they focus on what cannot be seen. They ask different questions. Who defined the situation? Who shaped the expectations? Who planted the first idea? Because the one who answers those questions correctly is usually the one already winning, even if no one realizes it yet. Consider this carefully. When two people enter conflict, most observers believe the outcome will depend on who argues better. But the truth, it depends on who framed the conflict first. If one person successfully positions themselves as calm, reasonable, trustworthy, before the conflict begins, then every reaction from the other person will be measured against that image. Suddenly, emotion becomes weakness. Passion becomes aggression. Defense becomes guilt. Not because it truly is, but because perception has already been shaped. And once perception is shaped, reality bends around it. This is the hidden battlefield most people never see. They think they are fighting facts, but they are actually fighting interpretations. And interpretations are far more powerful than facts, because facts require attention. Interpretations require belief. There is a principle that governs every situation, whether you realize it or not. Perception creates reaction. Reaction creates outcome. Most people focus only on the outcome. Some focus on reaction. Very few focus on perception. And that is why very few people consistently win. Not because they lack intelligence, but because they fight at the wrong level. Imagine walking into a negotiation believing the discussion begins when people sit down. That is the illusion. The negotiation began days earlier, in conversations you were not part of, in impressions formed long before your arrival, in subtle expectations planted in other minds. By the time you walk in, the room already has a direction, and if you are unaware of that direction, you will unknowingly follow it. Now, here is where things become even more dangerous. Most manipulation is not about forcing people to do something. It is about making people believe they chose it themselves. Because when someone believes a decision is their own, they defend it, they protect it, they justify it, even when it works against them. That is the true power of silent manipulation. It does not create resistance. It creates agreement. Not forced agreement. Natural agreement. Comfortable agreement. Agreement that feels logical, even when it was carefully engineered. This leads us to the first rule of manipulating any situation without anyone knowing. Control perception before controlling outcomes. Not after. Before. Always before. Because once perception hardens, outcomes follow naturally. You do not push people toward decisions. You guide how they see the situation. And once they see it the way you intend, they move in the direction you prepared. Without pressure. Without suspicion. Without resistance. That is the elegance of strategic manipulation. It is quiet. Invisible. Almost artistic. Let us make this real. Imagine entering a room where a decision must be made. Most people arrive ready to argue. They gather facts. They prepare points. They rehearse logic. But the strategic individual, they prepare perception. They ask, how do I want others to see this situation? What assumptions must exist before discussion begins? What emotional tone should dominate the room? They do not wait for the moment to shape reality. They shape reality before the moment exists. And that is why their influence feels effortless. Not because it is easy, but because it was prepared. Now understand this clearly. Manipulation is not always malicious. It is not always destructive. It is a tool. And like any tool, its power depends on the hands that hold it. Some use it to deceive. Others use it to protect. Some use it to dominate. Others use it to guide. But whether used wisely or recklessly, it exists everywhere. In business, in leadership, in relationships, in everyday interactions. Even in moments that appear completely ordinary. Because every situation contains influence. And influence, when structured carefully, becomes manipulation. Not loud, not obvious, but precise, calculated, and effective. Most people live unaware of this structure. They walk into conversations believing fairness governs outcomes. They assume truth naturally rises. They trust that logic alone wins. But reality is not that generous. Reality rewards preparation. Reality rewards positioning. Reality rewards those who understand how situations are built, not just experienced. And once you begin to see this, you begin to see something unsettling. You begin to notice patterns, repeated outcomes, predictable reactions, moments where decisions seem spontaneous, but are actually guided, not by force, but by framing. Because here is the truth most people never realize. The moment you define a situation, you limit the possible outcomes. And the person who defines it first holds the advantage, not visibly, not dramatically, but structurally. Like an architect designing a building long before anyone steps inside. To outsiders, the structure feels natural, but in reality, every wall was placed deliberately. Every path was designed intentionally. Every movement anticipated in advance. And that is what true situational manipulation looks like. Not chaos. Design. But here is where the real power begins to reveal itself. Because once you understand framing, once you understand perception, once you understand how situations are quietly shaped, you begin to realize something even more unsettling. Most situations are not neutral. They are preloaded, prepared, guided, long before you ever notice them. And the most dangerous part? The person controlling the situation rarely looks powerful. They rarely look dominant. They rarely look aggressive. Instead, they look calm, reasonable, almost passive. Because true control does not require noise, it requires structure. And this is where most people make their greatest mistake. They believe power shows itself. They believe manipulation is visible. They believe control looks obvious. But real manipulation hides inside normal behavior, inside ordinary conversations, inside harmless moments, inside silence. Especially inside silence. Because silence, when used correctly, does something extraordinary. It creates space. And in that space, other people reveal themselves, their fears, their intentions, their weaknesses, their expectations, all without being asked. And once you see those patterns, you begin to understand how to guide them, not forcefully, but naturally. Almost invisibly. But the real danger is not in knowing this. The real danger is in realizing how often it has already been used against you. Moments you thought were fair, but were framed. Conversations you believed were neutral, but were guided. Outcomes you accepted, without realizing they were designed. Not against you personally, but against your awareness. And awareness is the true battlefield, because once you become aware, you stop reacting blindly. You stop walking into situations unprepared. You stop assuming outcomes depend only on effort or intelligence. Instead, you begin to see the architecture behind events, the invisible scaffolding shaping reactions, the hidden blueprint guiding outcomes. And once you see the blueprint, you can begin to design your own. But here is where most people hesitate. They believe shaping situations requires force, aggression, dominance. But that belief is wrong, because the most powerful manipulation is not loud. It is subtle, not aggressive, but deliberate, not forceful, but strategic. And this leads to a realization that changes everything. The strongest position in any situation is not the one that reacts. It is the one that defines what the situation means, not what happens. What it means. Because meaning controls reaction. Reaction controls behavior. Behavior controls outcome. And the person who controls meaning controls the future of the situation, even before it unfolds. But understanding this is only the beginning, because knowing that situations are framed is one thing, and learning how to shape those frames is something else entirely. And this is where the real shift happens, because the next stage is not about awareness, it is about preparation, positioning, pre-arranging reality before others realize it has begun. And once you understand that process, you stop reacting to situations, you start building them, quietly, patiently, deliberately. But the real power isn't in reacting to situations, it's in shaping them before anyone realizes they've begun. And in the next phase, you will see exactly how strategic individuals do this, how they position themselves long before the moment arrives, and why those who master preparation rarely need to fight at all. Because by the time others recognize the situation, the outcome is already moving in your direction. If what you've heard so far is beginning to change how you see situations, then you already understand something most people never will. Because once you start seeing the hidden structure behind events, you can never go back to reacting blindly. Subscribe now, not for entertainment, but for awareness. Because in the next phases of this journey, you will learn how to position yourself before situations even begin. And those who arrive prepared rarely find themselves controlled by others. Most people believe situations are won inside the moment. They believe victory belongs to the fastest thinker, the strongest speaker, the most confident presence in the room. But those who truly understand power know something different. The moment itself is rarely where control is established. Control is established before the moment arrives, long before anyone notices. Because the greatest manipulators do not wait for situations to begin. They prepare the environment that gives birth to them. The principle of pre-positioning. Every situation begins with invisible preparation, not paperwork, not planning schedules, but preparing perception. This is called pre-positioning. And once you understand it, you begin to see why some people seem to win effortlessly. Not because they are lucky, not because they are naturally dominant, but because they have already shaped how others expect the situation to unfold. Think about this carefully. If you enter a conversation where people already trust you, your words carry weight. If you enter a room where doubt surrounds you, even your strongest arguments sound suspicious. Nothing changed about your intelligence. Nothing changed about your message. Only perception changed. And perception is everything. Strategic individuals understand this deeply. Before stepping into any situation, they ask, what assumptions already exist? What expectations must be planted? What emotional tone should exist before I arrive? They do not walk into situations hoping to win. They walk into situations that were already prepared for them to win. Tool number 1, control the narrative before others do. Every situation begins with a story. Not a visible story, but an internal one. The one people tell themselves about what is happening and why. Who is trustworthy? Who is reasonable? Who is dangerous? Who is wrong? This story becomes the lens through which everything else is judged, and once a narrative exists, facts become secondary, not irrelevant, but weaker, because facts fight for attention, narratives guide interpretation, and interpretation decides the outcome. So the first tool of silent situational manipulation is simple. Control the narrative before it controls you. Not loudly, not aggressively, subtly, quietly, early, before the situation fully forms. This is called narrative seeding. It happens in casual conversations, in offhand remarks, in seemingly harmless observations. Small statements that shape how people see what is coming, not by forcing conclusions, but by guiding expectations. For example, instead of arguing later that you are reasonable, you position yourself early as calm and thoughtful. Instead of defending your intentions later, you allow others to assume them positively beforehand. By the time the situation begins, your image is already stable, and stability creates influence. Tool number 2, strategic silence. Most people talk too much, not because they are confident, but because they are uncomfortable with silence. Silence feels like vulnerability. Silence feels like loss of control. So they fill the air with words, explanations, clarifications, justifications. But strategic individuals understand something few people realize. Silence creates pressure. Not outward pressure, internal pressure, inside the minds of others. Because when silence exists, people begin to fill the gaps themselves. They speculate, they assume, they reveal, not because they are forced, but because silence makes them uncomfortable, and discomfort reveals information. Information about fears, information about expectations, information about weakness. The person who speaks less often learns more. And the person who learns more controls more. Strategic silence is not absence, it is observation. It is control disguised as stillness. It allows others to expose their thinking before you reveal yours. And once their thinking is visible, you gain leverage, not through force, but through understanding. Tool number 3, emotional steering. Here is a mistake most people make. They believe manipulation means controlling emotions. That is not accurate. You rarely control emotions directly. You steer them, like water flowing through channels. You guide emotional direction without appearing to influence it. Because emotions are powerful, but predictable. Fear leads to caution. Relief leads to agreement. Urgency leads to decision. Strategic individuals do not fight emotions. They create emotional pathways. They introduce small pressures, small comforts, small shifts in tone, until others move emotionally in directions that serve the desired outcome. Not forced, not obvious, but natural. For example, creating calm before presenting an idea increases acceptance. Creating urgency before presenting options increases decision speed. Creating reassurance before proposing change reduces resistance. These emotional environments shape reactions long before logic enters the conversation. And once emotions move in your direction, logic follows behind them. Tool number 4, controlled options. Most people believe power lies in giving freedom, but in reality, power lies in structuring choices, not removing freedom, limiting direction. Because when people feel they have options, they feel in control. But when those options are carefully structured, they move toward outcomes you prepared. This is called controlled options, not forcing decisions, designing them. Imagine presenting 2 paths. Both appear valid, both appear independent, but both lead toward the same general outcome. The individual feels empowered, but the situation remains guided. That is the elegance of structured choice. It removes resistance, because resistance usually comes from feeling trapped. But when people believe they are choosing freely, they rarely resist, even when their choices were designed. Most people think situations exist in isolation. One meeting, one conversation, one decision. But strategic individuals see situations differently. They see them as chains, linked events, each shaping the next, each influencing what follows. This is called momentum. And momentum is one of the most powerful forces in situational control. Because once direction is established, it becomes easier to maintain, harder to reverse. Think of a rolling object. At first it moves slowly, but once speed builds, stopping it becomes difficult. Situational momentum works the same way. A small perception becomes a belief becomes an expectation becomes a reaction, and reaction becomes outcome, not instantly, but progressively. That is why early positioning matters more than late correction. Because once momentum exists, control becomes easier, and resistance becomes weaker. Why most people fail to use these tools? Not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack ability, but because they lack patience. Most people want visible results, immediate outcomes, quick victories. But true situational manipulation requires something rare: delayed action, preparation without recognition, positioning without applause, silence without validation. And that feels uncomfortable, because the human mind craves acknowledgement. It wants visible proof of effort. But strategic power often grows in silence, unnoticed, uncelebrated, until the moment arrives, and everything unfolds smoothly. Not by chance, but by design. Here is something few people realize. If you do not structure a situation, someone else will. Not always intentionally, not always maliciously, but inevitably. Because human environments naturally create narratives, naturally create expectations, naturally create momentum. And if you are not guiding that movement, you are being carried by it. Unknowingly, without resistance, without awareness. That is why passive individuals often feel unlucky. They believe outcomes happen randomly. But randomness is often just unseen structure, invisible preparation, hidden influence, operating quietly in the background. At this stage, something begins to shift inside you. You stop seeing conversations as simple exchanges. You start seeing them as environments, spaces where perception moves, where emotion flows, where choices form. And once you begin to see that structure, you begin to realize how many opportunities exist around you. Not dramatic opportunities, subtle ones. Moments where silence matters. Moments where tone matters. Moments where timing matters. Moments where perception shifts quietly. And those small shifts create massive outcomes later. There's a moment in every strategist's development when understanding becomes instinct. When observation becomes preparation, when preparation becomes positioning, and positioning becomes influence. Not loud influence, not aggressive influence, but quiet certainty, the kind that does not require force, because force is a last resort, not a first move. And this leads us to the realization that separates amateurs from masters. The greatest manipulators do not control moments. They control momentum. They guide direction long before outcomes appear. They shape reactions before resistance forms. They build pathways before decisions arrive. And by the time others recognize what is happening, the movement is already underway. Too established to stop easily. too structured to collapse suddenly, too deliberate to fail accidentally. But momentum alone is not enough, because the final stage of mastery is not about guiding single outcomes. It is about designing entire sequences, predicting reactions, anticipating responses, building situations that unfold exactly as expected. Not perfectly, but predictably. And once you understand how to build that level of control, you stop reacting to life situations. You begin constructing them, step by step, move by move, quietly, deliberately. But the greatest manipulators don't just control moments, they control momentum. And in the final phase, you will see how true strategists move beyond single victories, how they design chains of outcomes, and why those who master anticipation rarely find themselves surprised again. Because the true architect of power does not wait for situations. They build the future before it arrives. Now think carefully. Look back at your own life, your past conversations, your past conflicts, your past decisions. How many situations were truly yours, and how many were quietly shaped by someone else? I want you to be honest. Write it in the comments. What is one moment in your life where you now realize the situation may have been shaped before you even understood what was happening? Because awareness begins the moment you stop ignoring the patterns around you. Most people believe power is about winning moments, winning arguments, winning negotiations, winning conflicts. They think victory is something that happens suddenly, inside a single decisive encounter. But those who understand the deeper structure of influence know something far more unsettling. Real power is not about winning moments. It is about controlling what happens before and after them. Because the true strategist is not focused on isolated victories. They are focused on sequences, chains of outcomes, moments connected so precisely that each one leads naturally into the next, until resistance becomes almost impossible. Not because people are forced, but because direction has already been established. The momentum principle. Why one move is never just one move. Every action creates reaction. That is obvious. But what most people fail to understand is this. Every reaction creates the next situation. And the person who anticipates that next situation gains control over what follows. Strategic individuals do not act randomly. They act with foresight. Every word spoken, every silence held, every reaction displayed is not just for the present moment. It is designed for the moment that comes after. This is what creates momentum. Not emotional momentum. Not physical momentum. Situational momentum. The slow, invisible buildup of direction. The steady shaping of expectations. The gradual narrowing of possible outcomes. Until eventually, the situation feels inevitable. Not forced. Not dramatic. Just natural. That is when mastery begins. When outcomes feel natural, but were never accidental. The power of anticipation. There is one question that separates reactive individuals from strategic ones. Not, what is happening right now? But, what happens next? This single shift in thinking changes everything, because anticipation transforms reaction into preparation. Instead of responding emotionally, you begin positioning logically. You begin thinking in sequences. If I say this, what will they feel? If they feel that, what will they do? If they do that, what situation will form? Each move becomes a calculation, not cold, not mechanical, but deliberate, measured, aware. Because anticipation is the bridge between observation and control. It allows you to see patterns before they fully appear, to sense direction before it becomes obvious. And once direction becomes predictable, it becomes manageable. There is a moment when learning becomes transformation, when understanding these principles stops being theory and starts becoming instinct. That moment marks the birth of what can only be described as the architect mindset. Most people enter situations like visitors. They walk into environments that already exist. They accept conditions as given. They react to structures they did not build. But the architect? The architect does not accept environments. They design them. They shape the conditions under which decisions are made. They create pathways. Others walk without noticing who built them. Not through force, through structure, through anticipation, through patience. Because true control does not come from reacting inside the environment. It comes from designing the environment itself. Why most people remain participants, not designers. Not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack potential, but because they lack awareness of structure. Most people see moments. Strategists see systems. Most people see conversations. Strategists see patterns. Most people see reactions. Strategists see chains. And chains create predictability. Predictability creates influence. Influence creates control. But this control is not loud. It is quiet, almost invisible. Because true power rarely announces itself. It simply unfolds, exactly as expected. The cost of ignorance. There is a price for not understanding these principles, and it is rarely obvious at first. It does not appear as dramatic failure. It appears as repeated frustration. Missed opportunities, unexplained resistance, moments where outcomes never seem to align with effort, moments where logic fails to persuade, moments where truth feels powerless, not because truth is weak, but because perception was stronger, because someone else shaped the structure, someone else guided expectations, someone else built the invisible framework that defined what was possible. And without awareness of that framework, you walk inside it blindly, believing outcomes are random, believing results are unfair, believing resistance is unavoidable, when in reality, the structure was simply never yours. The strategic shift from reaction to design. At this stage, something inside you begins to change. You stop seeing situations as sudden events. You begin seeing them as slow constructions, built piece by piece, moment by moment, conversation by conversation. You begin to notice how tone influences reaction, how timing influences emotion, how framing influences belief. And once belief shifts, everything else follows. Not instantly, but inevitably. Because belief shapes behavior. Behavior shapes direction. Direction shapes destiny. And the person who shapes belief shapes destiny itself. Quietly. Without spectacle. Without resistance. The reality of long-term influence. Short-term manipulation creates temporary results. Long-term manipulation creates stability. That is the difference between amateurs and masters. Amateurs focus on winning today. Masters focus on shaping tomorrow. Not in dramatic leaps, but in small, calculated steps. Each one reinforcing the last. Each one strengthens direction. Until eventually, momentum becomes unstoppable. Not because it cannot be resisted, but because resistance becomes exhausting. Too late. Too costly. Too difficult. And that is when outcomes begin to feel inevitable. Power is rarely about dominance. It is about direction. The loudest voice in the room is not always the strongest. The most aggressive individual is not always the most dangerous. Often, the strongest person is the one who speaks the least, moves the least, but understands the most. Because understanding creates leverage. Leverage creates influence. Influence creates outcomes, not instantly, but consistently. And consistency is the true mark of mastery. If you have followed this journey carefully, something inside your perception has shifted. You no longer see situations as random encounters. You see them as structures, not chaotic, but designed, not unpredictable, but guided. You stop seeing yourself as a participant. You begin seeing yourself as a designer, an architect, not of buildings, but of environments, of conversations, of expectations, of outcomes. And once that identity shift occurs, you stop fearing situations. You begin studying them. You stop reacting emotionally. You begin positioning logically. You stop hoping for favorable outcomes. You begin preparing them. Quietly, deliberately, patiently. The greatest advantage you gain from this knowledge is not control over others. It is control over uncertainty. Because uncertainty disappears when patterns become visible, when reactions become predictable, when structures become understandable. You begin to see where situations are heading, long before others recognize the direction. And once direction becomes visible, you gain time. Time to prepare. Time to position. Time to guide. And time is the most valuable advantage of all. There is one final truth that defines mastery. The strongest person in any situation is not the loudest, not the fastest, not the most aggressive. It is the one who shapes what everyone else believes is happening. Because belief shapes reaction. Reaction shapes behavior. Behavior shapes outcome. And outcome shapes reality. Not instantly, but inevitably. And now you understand something most people never see. How situations are shaped, how perception is guided, how outcomes are prepared long before they appear. But there is one final truth you must never ignore. The same knowledge that allows you to guide situations also allows others to guide them against you. That is why this journey does not end here. In the next 72 hours, another video will be released, one that reveals the opposite side of power, how to avoid being manipulated and catch manipulators before they control the situation. Because knowing how influence works is power, but recognizing it when used against you, that is survival. So stay alert, stay aware, and be ready. Because the next lesson may be the one that protects you from forces you never saw coming. If this video changed how you see power, how you see conversations, how you see situations, then do not keep this knowledge to yourself. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to understand how influence really works before they find themselves controlled by forces they never saw coming. And subscribe. Because the next video, releasing in the next 72 hours, will teach you how to recognize manipulation before it traps you. Not everyone prepares. Not everyone learns. But those who do rarely find themselves powerless.